I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Just Nowhere. Tonight, I'll be interviewing Jeffrey Mishlove. He was the host of the interview show Thinking Aloud, which aired on PBS from 1988 to 2002. He interviewed such researchers as Rollo May, Theodore Roszak, Steven Pinker, David Chalmers, Marvin Minsky, Houston Smith, Jacob Needleman, and an endless host of other respected scholars. Since 2015 to the present, Mishlove has resurrected the program under a slightly new title, New Thinking Aloud, which is a YouTube channel. And observation to make here, this is New Thinking Aloud often enters into very controversial subjects, right, from the standpoint of academia, parapsychology, or parapsychological events, or psi as it's known. As I make clear in the interview, I take a middle position. Um, I I don't openly advocate for the reality of parapsychological phenomena, but neither am I a skeptic or scoffer. I think the accurate way to describe this is that the question of the reality of unusual anomalous events like ESP, for instance, or precognition, these are open questions which are currently being debated in peer-reviewed academic journals, right? So both sides should be accorded, right, respect and recognition, right, of experts in academia, in the very sciences. This is not a debate that is exclusive to skeptic organizations versus fervent believers. There are both of those positions exist, but there's a middle road, which is to conduct research on the question of the reality of anomalous phenomena, right, in um, peer-reviewed journals, which are acknowledged, right, as dispassionate scientific media, right, by both sides on the question. All right, so with that, let's go to the interview where Jeffrey Mishlove, right, is describing his work for us. Thank you.
For the last 50 years, I've been conducting interviews like this one,
Mm.
focusing on philosophy, psychology, health, science, and spirituality, but always with a heavy dose of conversations relating to the paranormal.
Mm. I've known your work since the 1980s when I was still in my 20s, I'll have to say. Um, and that was, correct me if you need to, but I believe that that would have been on PBS, like 1988 to a little after 2000. Um, and now, as you say, you have a new instantiation or new incarnation of this new thinking aloud on YouTube, and that started in 2015.
That's correct. Yeah, the original public television series ran from 1987 to 2002. And even before that, I was doing radio interviews.
I see. I see. Well, it made quite an impression on me, as someone in my 20s. I remember the interviews you did with experts like Rollo May. And then there was Theodore Roszak, right, who was talking about extended mind, which is now sort of, accepted, I think, as non-exotic in the field. But back then it was really cutting edge. And then there was Steven Pinker, the linguist, people like David Chalmers, Marvin Minsky, AI expert, but also he had this interesting linguistic theory, sort of the symphony of language, and then comparative religion experts like Houston Smith and Jacob Needleman. It was really wonderfully enriching, and to see the show right up again under under a slightly new revised title. It's was really a delight for me, and I have to ask you this because for some reason, probably because I haven't listened as much as I should have, but I've never heard anyone um, ask you, right? Is the word allowed? Is that a pun also of ALOUD?
Well, it is, yes.
All right.
The the title was actually given to us by a man named Arthur M. Young, who was a mentor of both myself and my co-producer back in those days, Arthur Block. Arthur Young
Uh-huh.
was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, and he became a cosmologist. He wrote The Reflexive Universe and many other books, The Geometry of Meaning. And he intended to write a book called Thinking Aloud,
Mm,
using our spelling.
mm,
But when he learned that we were launching this television series, he suggested that we take the title instead.
I see. I see. To me, and again, correct me if I'm just fantasizing this, but it seems to me that in view of some of the topics you've dealt with in your interviews, which can be controversial, especially among scholars and the academic community, that maybe there's an implication in thinking aloud that some of these topics, right, are unjustly, right, censored.
I think that's exactly correct.
All right, all right, excellent. Well, all right. So you're, I know, a licensed clinical psychologist, and as you said, radio and television interviewer. But also your work at Berkeley was really in parapsychology, and so those who've listened to my programs, my interviews, this is probably going to be new territory, even though, right, in my interviews with Max Velmans and Lee Irwin, right, we did sort of skirt the boundaries, I think, of, topics like precognitive dreams and cosmic consciousness. But I've never devoted an entire interview to this. And because there's so many prejudices and I think misinformation, right, among academics and scholars about parapsychology. I thought maybe you and I could have a conversation about that field, and I will make a few statements that I actually have learned from some of your interviews, and then you can freely comment and expand on any of these points you want to. But the first point, I think, which will surprise a lot of academicians, is the fact that the Parapsychological Association has been officially affiliated with the world's largest general scientific society since 1969. And that, of course, that's the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And in fact, the debate about parapsychology is, in fact, right, this is carried out in peer-reviewed academic journals, not that all sides recognize, right, as peer-reviewed academic journals, not relegated to exclusively pseudoscientific or uh, other types of journals. Uh, that I think will be surprising to a lot of people. That the debate back and forth, right, has been going on for longer than my lifetime, right, in academic peer-reviewed journals. That was I learned that from you. It's quite surprising actually, because I don't think most people, for instance, where I attended university and got my degrees, I don't think maybe there was even a single professor who would know those basic facts. They would just say, "Well, this is pseudoscientific. This is the area for debunkers to deal with and skeptics. This is just no evidence for it." So, do you want to expand on that and enlighten us further?
I can. The uh, first beginnings of scientific inquiry into the paranormal go back to 1882 with the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in England.
Mm,
Uh, and many of the most prominent members of the scientific community and members of society were engaged uh, with that society from the very beginning. For example, William James, who is considered the founder of American psychology, was very active in the field of psychical research as it was then known. Uh, Sir Arthur Balfour, who later became Prime Minister of England,
mm,
was a member of the society. Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, some of the greatest physicists of that era, uh,
mm,
were also members of the society, a very distinguished group of people. In the United States, the field really became known as parapsychology in the 1930s
mm,
when J.B. Rhine established a parapsychology laboratory at Duke University. Rhine also established the Journal of Parapsychology. That's another peer reviewed journal. The Society for Psychical Research has a journal and proceedings going back now 140 years. There are
mm,
literally hundreds and hundreds of peer reviewed scientific experiments published in the field. And I think an important milestone occurred in 2018 when
mm,
the American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, published a lengthy article reviewing all of the research in parapsychology, pointing out that as conditions got stricter and stricter because there's been this constant debate with
mm,
skeptics, the research has remained strong. The data is stronger than many other well accepted findings in the behavioral sciences and even the medical sciences. For example, the statistics supporting the existence of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis are stronger than the statistics that show that taking an aspirin will help prevent heart attacks. And
right.
yet, millions of people are taking aspirins. I do myself on a daily basis for that reason. So, uh, the resistance is still, even after all of that, the resistance is enormous. After the article was published in the American Psychologist, some of the scoffers, as I
Mm,
prefer to call them, I don't think they are genuine skeptics,
mm,
but they published a rebuttal to it saying it doesn't matter how good the data is. We don't even have to look at the data because we already know that this is impossible.
mm,
And
mm.
uh, so they leave it at that.
Well,
That
my
is their position. And unfortunately, that's
mhm,
the position that is dominant within the academic community, primarily,
mhm.
with very few exceptions.
I would say that I think a dispassionate description of the situation would be that, right, sure, that rebuttal was published, but that's just part of the normal scientific process, right? It goes back and forth, right? And so what we can say now, I think, is that that particular article you're mentioning by Etzel Cardenia, right? Let me read a line that stood out to me. Um, is towards the end. The positive case for psi should not be overstated because our knowledge of it is far from satisfactory and scientific. Um, conclusions are tentative. The level of replication, although comparable to other areas, leaves much to be desired. The ESs, the effect sizes, right, are small, and theories need to be developed and tested further. I think that's a fair description, right? It's not the debate is not closed. It will continue going back and forth, just like so many other open questions in science. So I think it's really unfair just to scoff at it and say, well, impossible, right? Move on. It's just, to be fair, one has to concede. Both sides have to concede that the question of the reality of these parapsychological phenomena or psi, right? It's a matter of professional debate that's still ongoing in peer-reviewed, respected scientific journals. To me, that's pretty amazing that I didn't know that, until when I came across your work. Uh, and I don't think I've ever met, as I say, a professor or anyone in academia who's aware of that. And so, really, what I think that Cardenio referred to, my memory's a little vague here, but some probably misinformed skeptics. I think that's maybe the term that he used. But that's certainly, yeah, there's a lot of misinformation, or not even misinformed. They're just totally uninformed because they haven't, in an unbiased way, especially dispassionate way, educated themselves, in the situation where we
Well,
find
let
this.
me go a step further. The people who call themselves skeptics, many of them,
Mm,
take the attitude that there isn't a shred of evidence, that there's
mhm.
nothing to see. And that, to me, is intellectually dishonest.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you. There are two other points I'll hit on very briefly from Cardenio's essay. And the one was he quotes a Harvard professor, Robert Rosenthal. This quotation: 36 labs attempted to replicate 16 psychology studies published in top journals, and only 34% of the replications fell within the confidence intervals of the original study. So it's just not parapsychology studies that are difficult to replicate. This happens in standard psychology. And the other point is another quotation here: Psi research has initiated, and this again, I had to apologize. I was totally ignorant of this fact. Psi research has initiated or developed rigorous or procedural and analytical strategies that mainstream psychology adopted later. That's amazing in view of what we often hear about psi and parapsychological experiments, that they're flawed, biased, etc., etc. In any case, would you want to add anything to those final points?
Well, I think it's because the field has been so intensely scrutinized and criticized that by and large,
Mhm.
in my experience, parapsychologists go the extra mile to make their studies as rigorous as possible, knowing in advance that no matter how strong the evidence is and how well designed your experiments are, people are going to attack it viciously
Mhm.
because it challenges the materialist metaphysics that seems to be the ground of modern culture.
Mhm. Well, I know Cardenio pointed out that some of the objection to psi is justified with the claim that, well, these types of phenomena are simply impossible in the world we live in. But by that, right, is meant just commonsensical notions and experiences of space-time. Right? So, uh, and what Cardenio tried to do was invoke some examples from quantum physics, for example, to show that, right, these common sense experiences of time and space, actually we know that they're not the way the universe always is necessarily, right? There are some more nonsensical possibilities. I know even already before quantum mechanics, right? We had the relativity revolution from Einstein, right? With insights such as time dilation, and that time is not absolute; it's dependent on velocity and mass. And this just totally contradicts our everyday experience of time. Yet we know from experiments, repeated experiments that Einstein was correct, right? And now we have the GPS system in our cars, right? Every day we live by these contradictions of common sense. Anyway, uh, so let's get to some questions that I had for you, a sort of a small list. And I know you've written years ago now, I think it was 1975, a book called The Roots of Consciousness. And so, if I were to ask you this question, how would you respond? Do your best. What's your current understanding, right, of the nature and origin and function of consciousness? What is it? What does it do? According to your lights. Right?
Well, of course, there are multiple theories
Yes.
out there, and I, as, as you point out earlier, the philosophers will debate these theories for a long time. They've been debating them. I tend to lean toward philosophical idealism, which is a position that's been held by philosophers. Many great philosophers, including Kant and Schopenhauer and many of what are known as the German idealists, but it goes back to ancient Vedanta philosophy in India. And you might say it's consistent with the world's mystical and religious traditions. It's also a position espoused by Max Planck, the founder of
Mm,
quantum physics. And it's simply that consciousness is fundamental. You can't get underneath consciousness. It's not made out of atoms and quarks and molecules, just the opposite. Atoms and quarks and molecules emerge from consciousness.
mm. Yeah, that calls to mind a conversation I had with Dean Rickles, a philosopher and scientist at the University of Sydney in Australia, about what I usually call the epistemological cage or the epistemological barrier, right, that we all live with, and that is everything, all data, all experience is filtered through our consciousness. And I won't name him, but I recently did hear a physicist, a very well-known physicist, say that, well, we are not dependent on our subjective experience, right? For when it comes to physics experiments or something like this, because we rely on the evidence of patterns and repeated patterns, which is a really amazing statement because the fact is that all our observations of these repeated patterns, right, are filtered through our consciousness. You can't escape that epistemological barrier. So, at least to that extent, right, whether or not one accepts idealism as the most plausible explanation of consciousness, it uh, certainly nothing is more fundamental than consciousness in our experience. No matter what field we're engaged in, everything comes through it and then goes out through it, right?
You could even go so far as to say that the laws of physics that or
Mhm.
the regularities that we find in physics are actually laws of consciousness.
Yes, yes. Now, how would you coordinate consciousness with language?
That's a very interesting question, and I gather it's your specialty. I recently conducted an interview with James C. Carpenter, Jim Carpenter, who has written a book called First Sight. It's a psychological theory of the paranormal. And his point is that at the beginning of every thought process is an unconscious psychic event. So if language starts with thought, well, thought starts with something even deeper in the psyche that is very much akin to extrasensory perception or the paranormal. One way to think of it is that you and I are having a conversation. We are using language, but ultimately our thoughts, our intentions are being communicated, possibly, I think very likely, via telepathy. That the words are sort of riding on top of a deeper carrier wave, which is telepathic in nature.
Yeah, well, the way I can try to make sense of that, and you can correct me if you need to, or direct my thinking in a new area. Uh, as I often point out to interviewees, as we're speaking here, we're certainly not consciously deciding upon each and every word we're using. This is being generated from what most experts are calling the unconscious processes, or subconscious or subliminal. Right, there are a lot of different terms that are used. I know Lee Irwin prefers super conscious. Right, and
I
I can
like to call it intuition.
yes, yes, and I often also think of autistic savants, right? To seem to, according to Alan Snyder, right, seem to have direct access to information that usually, right, you and I would have access to that only indirectly, right? And for instance, there's one well-known case of an autistic savant who can repeat the first over 24,000 digits of pi. Right, he didn't memorize it. Right, and we know there are even blind autistic savants who can hear something like Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto for the first time and then play it flawlessly. Right, and so right? It seems to me that that's comparable to the situation of everyday speech. As you and I are speaking, it's sort of this amazing automatic progress. It's the difference between walking, right, on our feet, and then getting in an automobile, and right at much greater ease and far greater speed, right? And so the unconscious is sort of like that, or intuition, as you say, sort of like that car, and it's greatly, yeah, we call it an automobile, or it's an automatic. A lot of it is an automatic processes, and of course, I did agree with Lee about this terminology of superconsciousness, because it only takes a little bit of a thought experiment. If we can create an image of ourselves, and we go down into the unconscious or up into it, right? Once we're there, that would be fully conscious, and our conscious ego would be the thing that's really nearly unconscious, right? It has the very, very narrow scope, right, of perception and awareness, our conscious ego. So it's I think we call it the unconscious, right? Simply or purely relative to our consciousness, but the situation could be reversed. And the unconscious is where all the really interesting stuff is going on, like what as you term it, intuition. Anyway, that's my take on it. And I look at infants as they're acquiring language, and to me, it seems that they're acquiring uh, language and the ego, the consciousness of their ego, in tandem. They're really sort of like two sides of the same coin. And even though I would qualify that and say, I think the ego is grounded in a greater field, right, of awareness and consciousness. And that's sort of the tip of the iceberg, as Max Vellman's, right, uses that metaphor. So, yeah, tip of the iceberg. And so, um, All right, so those automatic processes which are generating all of this speech, yeah, I never thought of it as telepathy, but why not? I mean, that's it's it's just a different term. Well, this one you want to call it telepathy, I'll call it unconscious, but isn't it the same thing? I think it's getting the same thing done. So maybe it's at that level, maybe it's just a matter of semantics. I don't know. Um,
Tend to think that we could apply, and maybe it's a stretch because I'm not a physicist, but I think we
mhm.
could apply the idea of quantum entanglement here, that at the ground of being, everything, all particles are entangled with each other. Everything is connected. And as a
Mhm.
young infant develops, as you say, an ego, the whole idea of the ego is you form an inside and an outside. You're no
Yes.
longer one with everything. You become what's inside the skin, and everything outside the skin becomes the rest of the world. And you learn how to function that way. But at the deepest level, we're still connected. And all of the research in parapsychology suggests that we can access that connection.
Yeah, that reminds me of David Bohm. Many times in his writings, he referenced the work of Piaget, right, who made a link between the infant's language acquisition and maybe not the total creation, but at least the developing sense of the spatial, temporal recognition abilities of the infant. Right? So there's this, right? So I think it would probably be simplistic and an exaggeration to say that language creates the experience of space time, but they certainly seem to be really intimately imbricated within each other somehow, right? Yeah. Well, all right. Let's move on to another subject that I already mentioned, right? That I've at least raised right to Lee or with Lee Irwin and Max Fellman's, and that's the the phenomenon of precognitive dreams. And I always say I think any human being who will be honest, right, will admit or will know that maybe we can't explain these, and a person may be puzzled, but I've probably everyone has had one of these, if not more. I know I have. And what do you think? And again, right, there are lots of theories, and I know you've interviewed many people who have different theories about this, but what do you think are some of the implications of precognitive dreams for the nature of time and free will? Of course, those are two separate questions,
Well,
really.
of course, everything is interrelated, but it's not just dreams. People have precognition and very conscious, wide awake experiments in parapsychology. There are parapsychologists who feel that all psychic phenomena are based on precognition. I don't go that far, but it certainly suggests that our experience of time is limited to our normal wide awake state of consciousness, where we have clocks everywhere and watches. And these days I don't wear a watch because my iPhone is always telling me what time it is. So we're embedded in a world where we think that time is absolute, and that it can be measured by clocks. And of course, all the data of precognition contradicts that completely. But as you pointed out earlier, so does Einstein's theory of relativity
Mhm.
contradict that notion. A person, if you were to do Einstein's thought experiment and imagine yourself traveling on a light beam at the speed of light, if you had a watch on and held your watch up, it wouldn't move at all. You could travel from one end of the universe to the other, and from your point of view, it would take only an instant.
Mhm. Right.
Even though people here on the planet might experience billions of years. So
Mhm.
time is actually relative in that sense. And now, how does that implicate our understanding of free will? I think it has deep implications. It certainly would suggest that we don't have as much free will as we often think we do.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, yeah, I would agree with you on that point. But I always hasten to add that the concept that maybe we lack free will, or we don't have complete free will. After all, I think it's a basic psychological insight that even if we do have free will, it's certainly not complete or limited. It's always limited by experiences we've had, psychological wounds, on and on, et cetera, et cetera. There are limitations,
Sure.
right? But I would say that even, let's say, philosophically viewed, let's argue, just as a thought experiment, for complete absence of free will. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative proposition, at least not in everyone's viewpoint, right? There are traditional cultures like Islam, for instance, right? When tragedies or really amazing good things happen, the Muslims will often say it's maktub, or kismet, it's destiny. And this is often brings a sense, I think, of comfort to them, or consolation. And then in the Hebrew Bible, and this in this is one I like, Psalm 139. There's this very interesting verse that the psalmist is talking to God and says, "Oh God, you wrote all of my days before I lived my first day." I'm paraphrasing, but that's the point it says.
Yep.
And so it's the ancient metaphor of the universe, or life and existence, as a scroll or a written story, right? And that also, I think, for some people, it's not a negative thought at all. It's the exact opposite. It's maybe very intriguing, very interesting. It's so. Um, Also, what do you think about this? Uh, I don't claim to have an answer, about this question, that philosophers have been trying to figure out for millennia. So far be it from me, but I do have, speculations after my short lifetime so far, right? And that is that perhaps if we take a larger view, the dichotomy or even contradiction between free will and then predeterminism, maybe it could actually be resolved, right? As is often the case, right, upon closer examination of a question, um, right? Um, and I know a lot of ancient mystical authors deal with this. Esoteric authors deal with um, resolving binaries, right, into a unity. For instance, the inside and the outside, right, can be seen on one level, right, as artificial dichotomy. From a larger perspective, right, that's just really artificial. You look at a cup, for instance, and you say there's the outside of the cup and the inside of the cup. But if you just look at the cup, hey, it's a cup, right? So maybe free will and predeterminism are just two different ways of looking at a single phenomenon. And that's not an answer, but what do you think of that kind of approach?
Well, I struggle with it. I don't have an answer either. I'm inclined to think that uh, I like the notion of spiritual freedom, that there are moments
Mhm.
when we actually do make choices,
Mhm.
and those choices can influence us throughout the whole course of our life. I made important choices when I was in my early 20s, which is why ultimately I'm speaking with you today.
Mhm.
And I had to struggle at times to make those choices. So I'm inclined to think that that was an act of free will. Even and they may be quite rare. That's one way to think of it. But maybe a person of spiritual enlightenment has free will all the time. Uh,
Interesting.
on the other hand, uh, I like the philosophy of Spinoza. You referred to the
Mhm.
idea that uh, God is the decider of everything. And Spinoza seemed to feel, if I understand his philosophy correctly, that if you just accept that God is in charge, that you have no free will whatsoever, which was sort of a 17th, 18th century position on it,
Mhm.
that you could achieve a state of complete happiness just accepting that. So
Right.
I think these questions are still up for grabs.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, so from that perspective, one could even say that thinking that one has free will is basically thinking that one is in charge, and that's maybe a little arrogant, right? And we're taking over God's role. I guess that's one possible way of
There's
understanding
a
free will
lot
is.
of psychological research that suggests it's called locus of control in the field of
Mhm, mhm.
psychology.
Yes.
People who feel that the locus of control is within themselves tend to be more successful in life. People who
Mhm,
feel that they are at the mercy of other forces, and I particularly hear from viewers who uh, believe that the elite are controlling their
mhm,
lives. And uh, people who believe things like that tend to be less successful. It's not a healthy belief.
mhm, mhm. One last model, right, just to throw out there. Uh, Not seen too much written on this, but it certainly occurs, right, when one thinks about the ancient metaphor of the book, right? So let's say life and existence, the whole universe is this story
Yeah.
written by whatever we want to call it, the cosmic consciousness, God, or whatever. And so if this is an eternally authored story, then it would be like a book we can pull off our shelf or a DVD disc. It's all there. The data is all there. Consciousness, right, starts to play it, right?
Yeah.
And if it's a good story, we interact with it as if we could change, right, the course of events, right? Um, but one idea that's occurred to me, these are all just thought experiments, is that, well, if this is all predetermined from all eternity, it would not necessarily have to cancel out free will, because all of these choices made by all the protagonists in the story would have been free will choices made from all eternity, according to this script.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, um, I like a point that Noam Chomsky often makes. He often gets criticized for it, which just sort of baffles me. But be that as it may, and that is his point that if you look at a rat, right, we can put a rat in a labyrinth, and there's only so much that the rat can figure out, because it is what it is. It's the species that it is, and to do more than two or three right turns, or some complex pattern, is beyond the rat, right? And so humans, being physical structures and not angels, we are going to have the same types of limits, and there will be questions that perhaps as a species we will never be able to answer. That to me seems common sense. Yet Chomsky's been criticized, and a new label, as you probably have heard, right, was invented for this. It's called Mysterium, right? As if this is some kind of mystical idea or something. It's just I think, a totally natural observation. But right, there are, as you know, all of the great philosophical questions, like the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, have been debated for millennia, and it doesn't seem that we're any closer, right, to any greater depth of insight than Plato and Aristotle were on some of these questions.
Well, one of the reasons it doesn't seem that way is because the data of parapsychology is usually excluded from the discussion. If
All right.
we begin to integrate that data, I think it does point us in certain directions. But overall, I would say, reflecting back now, we've been speaking for a half hour or so.
Mhm.
Uh, One of the difficulties in having these conversations is that the terms get defined differently in different contexts. Like
Yes.
free will means one thing in a cosmic context, it means something else in a personal context, it means something else in a legal context, it means something else in a scientific context. And we can have a conversation, and when we're not defining our terms carefully, we jump from one definition to another without quite realizing it. And often that's why discussions seem to go nowhere.
Yes, yes, a good point. Yeah, so, well, that leads right into the next question, and that's, a big one, when it comes to humans and the musing about human existence. Other than that, that's life and death, right? And the possibility of survival after death, right? Which is usually framed in the language of, the survival of consciousness after death, right? And there, oh, wow, your point is well taken there too, because what one person means by consciousness is certainly not necessarily what everyone might mean by it, even experts, right? But in any case, I recall hearing a philosopher who was in his 90s, and he was musing about his earlier career, and a statement that he often made to his students at university was, death is not, all that big of a deal to me, because, when it happens, you're not going to be there anyway. So, it should not even be a matter of concern or research. But now, when he got to his 90s, he said, I think that was BS. He says, now that I'm close to the end, it's very important. And it's of very a deep, profound interest to me. And here I think of what we can call faith, in a certain sense, that our species, right, Homo sapiens sapiens, we use faith a lot, for instance, right, in contrast to knowledge, solid knowledge, when we're walking in a forest, for instance. We often use faith, what can be called faith, or we believe that a twig that's blowing could be a snake. Now, we don't know if it is or not, maybe, but we're going to, because of our evolutionary development, we have this belief, faith propensity. It's better to think or believe that it might be a snake than not, right? And so we don't have solid knowledge. And I've often wondered if this question of life after death um, might be a question that cannot be resolved with complete scientific certitude within the span of a human lifetime, but that one is faced with that reality of impending death when one gets older, especially. And you can't, you have to, one has to explore it, and one has to take up the challenge and just not say, well, I live by knowledge, not by faith, right? But to go back to your point, well, maybe if we take into account parapsychological evidence, maybe we can have a little bit more knowledge, right, about possibilities.
Well, you probably know that the Bigelow Institute in 2021 issued an essay competition for the best evidence for survival of consciousness after permanent bodily death. There were
Mhm,
29 different essays that received awards
mhm,
for that. They're about to publish something like 6 or 7 volumes, which will contain all of these essays. The essays
mhm,
themselves were, I think, 25,000 words each. And
mhm,
actually, research into this field began even before the Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882. So we have really more than 150 years of data. And if you look at some
mhm,
of the very best cases, I would say it's very hard to deny the possibility of survival, not just of consciousness, like merging into the vast reservoir of cosmic
Mhm,
consciousness, but personality and
mhm,
and talents and skills. I'll give you one example of a study that began in 1987, ran until about 1992, as I recall. A Swiss researcher, Wolfgang Eisenbeiss, got the idea that if we could get a deceased chess master to
mhm,
come back and communicate with a medium through automatic writing, and play a game of chess with a living chess master at that level, that would be a strong proof of the afterlife. And that's exactly what happened. Geza Maraxi, who at one time was the number 2 ranked chess player in the world, died in 1951, was reached through this medium, Robert Rollins. And Maraxi actually played a full game of chess with Victor Korchnoi, who at the time was a Russian chess master, also ranked number 2 in
mhm.
the world. And the game was played at that level of the Grand Master in chess. So uh, I would say that people who are concerned about whether there is a possibility of conscious survival after death ought to take a good look at that case.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it. Thank you for mentioning it. I know some of these incidents are just mind blowing, and well, one can react to it in two different ways. One can then go investigate the validity and the accuracy, right, of what's been told, or one can just say, well, that's impossible, ridiculous, let's move on. It's and rule it out just in principle, which I think, of course, that's what most people I've known in academia do, right?
Even
Unin-
people in parapsychology do that. It's no,
yeah. Well, some stories, especially like that one, is pretty amazing. It certainly bears some closer looking into. I don't doubt it at all. I don't doubt what you're telling me. It's just I try to be rigorous, so I have to investigate that for myself. Uh, it's but it's I've heard so many stories, right? And again, as I say, right, if a person is honest, they've heard mind blowing stories throughout their life from relatives, friends, and it may have been you who quoted him, and so I may have learned this through you. I'm not quite sure, but a little quip from the late great Freeman Dyson, who said that well, we know that ESP is reality, despite the I'm paraphrasing the poverty, right, of our scientific instruments, right. So that really, as they say, blew me away when I learned that the Freeman Dyson actually believed in ESP, because just a few days ago I had a private communication from an academic, right, a very respected scholar internationally, and just saying that, well, the evidence for ESP, the evidence is against it, right? And I haven't written him back, but my inclination would be that, well, is to refer him to the Cardenas 2018 essay and saying, look, this is an open subject in peer-reviewed journals, right? This is not debunkers and skeptics, right, getting just to dismiss it all. This is something that's being debated, right? Among trained scholars on both sides of the question. One cannot say, well, no, it exists or it doesn't exist. Well, all right, one can argue the case for or against, but both sides have to be respected. It's a debate that's going on, right, in peer-reviewed journals, and both sides are qualified. Uh, In any case, all right. So one final topic that I always like delving into is synchronicities. All right. So, um, in my conversations with again with Dean Rickles, right, he pointed out to me, as you certainly know, right, that Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, right, had long dialogues about synchronicity. But one day, Pauli's secretary sort of interjected or interrupted and said, "It's like these synchronicities are not rare, they happen all the time. This is what life is. It's just if you're not looking for them, you just don't notice them, but they're all around us." uh, have you heard that anecdote, and if so, what do you think about Pauli's secretary's idea?
Well, I can only speak about it in my own personal experience, and I would say synchronicities are not rare, but I haven't had one this today yet, and
All right.
I would say in my life I probably experienced 100,
Mhm.
and let's say in my adult life, so that works out to maybe two a year. The ones that really stand out. Uh, maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's even 10 a year. Maybe one a month. But
There.
that,
Yeah.
that that's certainly not the same as that they happen all the time.
Uh-huh.
However, I wouldn't be surprised if for some people they do. But there's also a risk in interpreting events that occur in real life outside of the laboratory,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
which is apophenia.
Yes.
Apophenia is a term that means assuming that it's a synchronicity when it might be just a normal coincidence.
Hmm. Hmm.
If we look at the science of probability, improbable events happen all the time. That's for sure. That doesn't
Right.
make them a synchronicity in a Jungian sense.
Right, right. Well, I know, I don't know if you're familiar with David J. Hand's book, The Improbability Principle, right? And that's this really, I think, provocative subtitle, Why Coincidences, Miracles, and Rare Events Happen Every Day, published in 2014. But it's basically scoffing, at any claim of what I think you and I would call a real synchronicity. In other words, very stupendous things happen every day, but hey, that's because of just the nature of the world and the complexity of it all. And so there's it's all really just random. Even amazing things that seem non-random really are just random and coincidences, right? And
Well, you'll never convince me of that, even though I understand every moment is unique. Every single moment will never be repeated again.
right.
So there's no question that there's a uniqueness. But I'll give you an example that from my own life, and I know
Mhm.
I'm not unique in this regard.
Right.
I've had a synchronicity that changed my life 180 degrees, and many other people have had such synchronicities.
Mhm.
It occurred in 1972 in March when I had a dream, a very powerful dream of my Uncle Harry, who I hadn't seen in many years,
Mhm.
who was 50 years older than me. But the dream was so intense that when I awakened from it, I was sobbing tears of
Mhm.
joy and singing a sacred song. I know you told me about today being a special day for you,
Mhm.
that it's
Yes,
your
yes.
father's yard site. We both share the Jewish heritage. And the song I was singing is probably one you'll know, Avinu Malkeinu, a
Yes,
song
yes, yes.
that's sung on the high holy holidays.
Yes.
As far as I know, limited to that. It's a very special song. So I'm awakened from a dream, singing this song, crying tears of joy. And I wrote home. I've never had a dream like that before or after. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." Well, my mother called me immediately. She said, "How did you know Uncle Harry had just died?" As
Mm,
best I can tell, he may have died almost at the very moment I had that dream. And it
mm,
changed my life. At the time, if you had known me in 1972, you would have seen a graduate student in criminology at
mm,
the University of California conducting group therapy sessions in the psychiatric unit of San Quentin prison with murderers and rapists. And after that dream, I realized I could no longer continue devoting my life to the negative side of
mm,
human deviance, that it was time to make a 180-degree shift and focus only on the positive side of human deviance.
mm, mm.
It, it caused a lot of struggle. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but I
Sure.
was in effect guided by dreams from that point forward and ended up developing a career doing interviews like this and getting a doctoral degree in parapsychology from the University of California.
Mhm. Yeah, that reminds me of a point that Arthur Eddington made, right, the physicist, uh, right, early 20th century. One of his ideas was how consciousness can affect, the trajectories of biological or physical evolution, right? And so this is similar, right? How a dream, which of course is, right, a manifestation of consciousness, a certain modality, I would say, right, can affect the course of a life, right, as it did with you. And as you say, right, that you're not unique, right, in that respect. I don't have any dramatic story like it's dramatic as that, but yeah, certainly my life has been affected by all sorts of dreams. I don't even know how to describe them all. Certainly the precognitive type, but others as well that were not precognitive, but were so real, right? That just left a permanent impression on my psyche and emotions to this day, right? But I think even more fundamentally, though, is this goes back to the question about survival of consciousness, and that is that I've had, at least three near-death experiences, but the first one was sort of around kindergarten, that around that era, where I drowned in a river, and um, let me tell the story, since this may interest you and certainly may interest my audience, but I sort of have to tell the story. It's very brief in order to make my point. Um, I was down at this river with my family. I had half siblings from both parents, so it was a big family, right? About 10 of us. And we were all down at the riverbank. It was just one street away from the river. That's where we lived. So and there were also strangers there, right? It was a hot day. Everyone was down by the river. And I did not know how to swim, but I walked out into the river because it's very, very shallow, very shallow. But suddenly the sand gave way beneath my feet. So I must have walked into some kind of cavity, some kind of hole. And I remember my head, right, going up and down in the water, up and down 7, 8 times. I was drowning. And then my next memory is I woke up on my back, perfectly fine, on the river shore, totally alone. So I walked back home. My mother was in the kitchen, and I said, "Why did you leave me alone at the river?" She said, "No, Samuel, we didn't. We were down there, and after about 5 minutes, we noticed you were gone. We thought you just walked back home, and we stayed there for about an hour." And so my whole life, I've wondered how to deal with it logically, because one possible logical way of looking at it is, well, maybe I was underwater for over an hour. It has happened. People have survived that. Um, you know, but how did I get onto the shore? Well, a Hollywood writer, one of my friends, right, at one in one conversation years later, said, you know what, if you tell that as a story, here's the ending of it, right? You get into your 50s, you're a world traveler, you want to visit your grandmother's grave. And as you're walking away from your grandmother's grave, you see a headstone with your name on it saying that you had died drowning, right, as a 5-year-old. But anyway, this is why I grew up loving the Twilight Zone program, because it seemed to me this is what real life seems to be like. Because thinking of like Borges, right, Jorge Luis Borges, um, a scenario in his stories would, for me to apply it to me, would be, all right, so did I actually drown? I just woke up in another world, not even knowing that it happened. Of course, I don't think that's what happened, but I will never know what actually happened, and that's that. It's just an irresolvable mystery to me what happened, right? So that impacted me in the sense that I've always experienced life as something that's extraordinarily interesting. Let's put it that way. And it's intriguing, like a Borges story or like a Twilight Zone episode, one of the more positive ones, right? Yeah.
When many people report missing time, there
Mhm.
probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a million people who have experienced missing time, which is one way to interpret your story. Something happened and you just have no memory of it. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and some people would say, well, you should go into hypnosis. Maybe you can recover the memory of what happened that way. And other people would say it's not reliable. At this point,
Right.
you could
Right.
just make
Right.
up a fantasy. Uh, that's another debate
Mhm.
people will have. But if you were to analyze all the cases that people have reported of
Mhm.
missing time and look at all the results, because many of them have undergone hypnosis,
Mhm.
you would see that there are some interesting patterns that show up.
Mhm. Well, I know our mutual friend Jacques Vallée, right? I've had conversations with him about hypnosis, and I think he has a balanced view about it. I don't want to go into the subject, but he's basically, one must recognize the dangers, right, for false information, false memories. But um, there there do seem to be some experts who know how to use the technique therapeutically and with a certain degree of successful memory retrieval, actual factual correct memory retrieval. But I've never educated myself on the subject, so I really can't.
Well, one thing I think that your story implies is that some intervention occurred. You were drowning, and the next thing you know, you're safe on the shore.
Yeah, yes, but anyway, I think it's for me, even though it was not a dream, it seemed to impact my life in a dramatic way, somewhat parallel or analogous to the dream you shared.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, the final question, if I may, if you indulge me with a personal question, right? As you look back on these decades of your career, and maybe life, because right, our career and life, right, they overlap. Have you ever thought about this? What have can you identify an essence or a meaning for you that you think, looking at your career, what has it been about for you on a personal level? Has a picture emerged yet for you, or what are your impressions? What has
Well,
your life been about, your career?
I can tell you that pretty explicitly.
All right.
Um, when I was a graduate student working in parapsychology, I did a lengthy study, a 10-year study, a field study with a man who claimed to be the world's most powerful psychic. And he would demonstrate over and over and over again uh, remarkable powers that seem to be an ability to control large scale events, the weather, hurricanes, cold spells in the middle of summer, hot spells in the middle of winter, very dramatic things, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, things of that sort. And on one occasion, after a very dramatic experience occurred, I took his training program. And he said to me, what do you want to do with this kind of psychokinetic ability? And I thought about it and I said, well, I don't really want to do any of the things that you do with it. My goal is to be a communicator to the public at large about the reality of psychic phenomena and esoteric culture. And I have to say, since that day, that's what my life has been about.
Wonderful. Well, do you have any concluding words?
When people ask me my final thoughts, I tell them my motto. My motto is something I don't think is humanly attainable, but I try to attain it. And that is to love everyone and everything all the time.
Very good. Well, the world would be a better place if we all lived according to that dictum. Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your time.
A pleasure to be with you, Samuel.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.